Happy Wednesday! You're listening to Mama Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. This week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we'll be covering the case of Jessica Chambers. She was set on fire in her own car in Courtland, Mississippi. She gave police one piece of evidence before she passed away. This will be part 2. If you haven't already, go back to part 1 because there's a lot you would have missed. And since we're all here for one thing and one thing only, let's get it. Just to recap briefly, in part 1, we talked about Jessica as a child, the way she grew up, her parents, and we went into the case of her murder. We also talked about a few people that were questioned by the police and eventually able to be ruled out. And we left on Quentin Tellis being questioned about a Taco Bell date night that he had with Jessica on the night that she was murdered that he seemingly forgot to tell police about. And we'll go ahead and get into part 2. Because now investigators are trying to piece together the rest of Jessica's movements from earlier that day. We know that she woke up. We know that she ran errands. She came home. She took a nap. And when she got a call, she left her house. We also know that she was last seen on CCTV cameras at the M&M gas station at 5:24 p.m. on the evening of her death. What we don't know is where Jessica was going and what she was doing in Batesville. We also don't know who she was last with. And the most important what that we don't know is what would cause somebody to set Jessica and her car on fire. So the police go back to the CCTV cameras to find somebody that Jessica also made contact with just hours before she was set on fire. Now, last week when we left off on part 1, we had just learned that Quentin had walked across the street to meet Jessica at the M&M gas station. He had given her money for food and he left. But as it turns out, this meetup at the M&M store had actually happened the day before Jessica was murdered. And later on, during Quentin's first trial, because spoiler alert, there are 2 separate trials against Quentin in regards to Jessica's murder. And during the first trial, homicide detective Tim Douglas kind of made it sound like Quentin just flat out lied about, what day he had met Jessica at the store. But in our reality, Quentin was asked about this more than a year after the murder took place, and I don't remember what I was doing last week, much less this exact day 1 year ago. So maybe this is just a memory lapse. And as far as this other person who may have made contact with Jessica on the day that she was murdered, we can see from the CCTV cameras that Jessica is in the parking lot of the M&M gas station, and you can clearly see her wave to somebody. But whoever she's waving at never comes into the view of the camera, and that person has never come forward to say that it was them that Jessica was waving at, or that they had saw her that evening and had not been questioned yet. So it's still a question today as to who this person was that she was waving at. And after we see Jessica wave to this mystery person, she makes a call to get in touch with Quentin Tellis. And this is according to her phone records. And you can see Quentin's driveway from the M&M gas station parking lot. The way the camera's angled, you can actually see the comings and going of his driveway. So you can see Quentin walking out of the store parking lot headed south, when at the same time Jessica pulls out of the parking lot also heading south as she pulls out of the gas station. Police start looking into the most obvious suspects first because, duh. And a few people that were able to be ruled out pretty quickly were Jessica's boyfriend, Travis Sanford, who she was dating at the time. He was actually in prison at the time of Jessica's murder. And of course, like it does, the rumor mill was running rampant. People were saying that Travis was involved in a gang and that maybe he had hired a hit or plotted to have somebody kill Jessica for being unfaithful to him while he was in prison. But after further investigation, Jessica's boyfriend at the time of her death, Travis Sanford, was able to be ruled out completely as a suspect. And he was actually extremely upset to find out what had happened to Jessica. So next up would be Jessica's previous boyfriend that she lived with in high school, Brian Rudd. But he was able to prove that he was completely out of the state of Mississippi altogether when Jessica was murdered. He had actually moved to Iowa after they split up, like I mentioned in part 1, so he had a completely solid alibi. A solid alibi doesn't get much better than being in a completely different state and being able to prove it. So the theory of the husband did it or the boyfriend did it was kind of out the window on this one. And even though the rumor mill was working overtime in Jessica's case, the police and investigators were able to conclude that Travis and anyone that he was associated with was not responsible for what happened to Jessica. So that theory doesn't work. And after this, I'm not sure if it was cell phone records or eyewitnesses, but somehow or another, they were able to figure out that Quentin had been at the same exact spot that Jessica was found at on the night that she was found burning alive, And according to reporter Janice Broach from WMC, he had been there after he borrowed his sister's vehicle. So none of this really looks good for Quentin as of right now. Because the spot where Jessica found was not like a known hangout for locals or teens. I mean, it was just a secluded part of the woods on a deserted road. But when investigators asked Quentin if he knew of anybody by the name of Eric or Derek that may have known Jessica, he tells them about a man named Derek Holmes. Quentin also tells them that Derek made Jessica feel really uncomfortable, and people from the M&M gas station say that when the two were in the store at the same time together, that Derek was always, making sly remarks, and Jessica always just kind of brushed it off and let it be. So this sounds like a promising lead, because Quentin claims that Derek was always hitting on Jessica and that maybe that was somebody that they would want to talk to. And when police pull Derek Holmes' record, they find that he's a registered sex offender and that he's also been arrested for the exploitation of a minor. So, again, this sounds like a promising lead. Derek is a sex offender with the hots for Jessica, who also happens to live in Courtland and just so happened to have the same exact first name that first responders thought that they heard when Jessica was trying to tell him who had done this to her. But holy freaking cow, y'all are not ready for Derek's alibi. Derek tells police that he was at home with his mom on the night that Jessica was murdered. So, of course, police ask him how he could remember exactly where he was at on this particular day, and he tells them that he rubs his mom's feet every night for her because she has a diabetic disorder that gives her problems with her feet. So, this man was at home rubbing his diabetic mom's feet at the time that Jessica and her car were being set on fire. And, of course, investigators just couldn't take Derek's word for it. They had to check his alibi out. And according to Derek's mom, he was not lying. She said he was at home that night and that he rubbed her feet for her every single night. But Derek's mom wasn't the only person in Derek's house that the investigators talked to. They also questioned a few of his siblings that were there at the time and a few of the neighbors that were outside in the front yard doing yard work or hanging out. So police questioned all of them, and they all said the same thing too, that Derek had been home that night on December 6, 2014, and that he did in fact rub his mother's feet every night for her. So this is either really creepy or really sweet, and I can't decide which one. Regardless of if it's sweet or creepy, this seems like the end of the Derek Holmes lead. So police are looking into a very long list of Erics or Dereks, and they start bringing every single one of them in for questioning. There was only one problem with this list of names that investigators were going through, though. Nearly every Eric or Derek on this list was a black man. And it got to the point that some of these men actually reached out to local news and media stations to make it known that they felt like they were being racially profiled and targeted for Jessica's murder just for being a black man. This caused a huge divide in the small town of Courtland. People who used to hang out together weren't speaking, and things were more segregated in Courtland than they had been in years and years. Some of the men had never even heard the name Jessica Chambers. And this case was drawing a very hard racial line in Courtland, and Jessica's friends and family said that Jessica would have been so upset if she would have seen the way that the white and black races were turning against each other, because they all say that Jessica loved everyone, that she never saw the color of their skin, she just liked to show them love. So remember the keys to Jessica's car that were found less than 1/8 of a mile away from the crime scene? During the trial, it'll come up that the man that found those keys was walking his daughter in a stroller and saw him in a ditch, and he picked them up and let his 1-year-old daughter play with them as they walked back to their house for him to lay his daughter down for a nap. After this man got home with the keys, he saw that the keys had a keychain on it that said something along the lines of like Ben Chambers Automotive Repairs or something with the name Ben Chambers on it, and he realized that this may be related to Jessica's case. So he called the police to come and take a look and see if they were related. And when the police arrived at his house to look at the keys, they asked the man where he had originally found the keys in the ditch at. So he walks the police back down to the approximate place where he found the keys at originally. And apparently the keys were put back on the ground in the quote-unquote same spot that they were found so that pictures could be taken for evidence. This kind of seems like evidence tampering to me. There is absolutely no way that those keys were placed back in the exact same spot that they were found in, and that each key was touching the same exact blade of grass that it had been touching when they were found. It literally would be impossible to place them in the exact spot that they were found, in the exact way that they were found. And I've already mentioned that Quentin's DNA was found on these keys, but there were also 3 other unidentified male profiles that were found on the keys as well. And the man that actually found the keys in the ditch to start with, his DNA results came back inconclusive when he was tested against the DNA that was found on the keys. When police went to tell Quentin that his DNA had been found on Jessica's car keys, he told them that he had driven her car a few times before, which got me thinking, how many sets of keys are my DNA all over? Just a thought. The DNA test that was actually used to test the keys is called a Y chromosome STR test, and some experts say that this type of testing is so often extremely unreliable, which would explain why the DNA of the man that actually found the keys in the ditch wasn't even a match. They weren't even able to match it exactly to him. And Quentin driving Jessica's car seems like a pretty logical reason for his DNA to be on the keys. There's no way to test to see how long the DNA had been on the keys, but there were still 3 other DNA profiles that were found on the keys that have never been identified. And the rumor mill was far from over for Jessica's case. People started to speculate that maybe Ben Chambers could have been the one responsible for what happened to Jessica. So as far as Jessica's dad, Ben Chambers, goes, he actually made it very clear that he wasn't exactly pleased with his daughter dating someone outside of her own race. And he was actually quoted saying, quote, "I'm not a racist. I got just as many black friends and Mexican friends as I do white. But I don't believe in mixing relationships. Now, ain't nothing wrong with it, don't get me wrong. They're more than welcome to come to my house anytime, but that's just the way I feel. That's the way I was growed up, and I don't believe in it." End quote. So everybody pretty much knew how Ben felt about his daughter dating outside of her own race, and this started an online theory that Ben may have killed his own daughter in a fit of rage over Jessica dating primarily African-American men. And from what I could find, the police didn't actually think that Ben was ever a viable suspect. Most everyone that worked in the Courtland Sheriff's Department knew Ben because Ben was actually the mechanic for the sheriff's office. So this is somebody that would have been around the police and the investigators, not only because he's the father of the murder victim that they're investigating, but also because he did return to work eventually, and they would have still been around him all the time. I have a pretty good feeling that if the police department was willing to question every Eric, Derek, Jarek, and Erica for miles, that they probably looked into Ben Chambers at some point and were able to quickly rule him out. And as weird as this sounds, there were actually gang members trying to help law enforcement solve this case. They wanted it solved so that police would get back to their offices and away from their gang activity that took place. So gang members were helping for all the wrong reasons, but regardless, they were still helping. On December 18th, 2014, Quentin was questioned for the second time by FBI agent Dustin Blunt. And this questioning took place at Quentin's house where he lived with his mom. During the interview, Agent Blunt asked if he and Jessica had ever had sex, and Quentin tells him that they had only ever slept together once, and that they had actually had sex inside of Jessica's car in a field on Quentin's mom's property. And since this interview was done at Quentin's house, Agent Dustin Blunt was able to kind of walk around the property and have a look at things. So he asked Quentin about a pretty big gas jug that he had seen inside the shed. The shed that sat in front of the Tellis house was used for storage. When Quentin was asked about this 5-gallon jug, he just told Agent Blunt that this was a gas jug that he used to keep gas in for his dirt bike, which dirt bikes take gas. That makes a lot of sense. But during this interview with Quentin, Agent Blunt failed to ask a pretty important question. Why would Quentin go through his phone and delete every call, every text message, anything related to Jessica, even as far as her contact information, out of his phone just the day after she was killed? Quentin deleted anything related to Jessica, and you would think that you would want to keep every message and voicemail from her to back up what you guys talked about and be able to go back and see exactly what time and day things took place, because memories are not that good. Our memories are just not what we make them out to be. But it would actually be years later before Quentin was finally asked about why he did this, and his answer was that he didn't feel like there was any need for Jessica's name, number, calls, or text logs to be on his phone if she was dead now. This is probably not the best reason I can think of, but as the questioning and the investigation progressed, it was finally pieced together that after their forgotten Taco Bell dinner, Quentin had borrowed his sister's car, and CCTV footage from the M&M gas station shows Quentin driving to the shed where he had already admitted to keeping those jugs of gas at. Once Jessica's car was processed, someone noticed that the passenger seat of Jessica's car was laid back all the way. And this is when one of the investigators remembered that Quentin had told Agent Blunt that he and Jessica did have sex in Jessica's car, even going so far as to tell him that they had to lay the seat back all the way to be in a more comfortable position. So this got a few of the police officers and investigators scratching their heads because Quentin said that they did not have sex on the day that Jessica was killed. They had actually had sex like a week before this, and police knew for a fact that there had been other people in Jessica's car after the one and only time that they had sex a week prior. So there had been other people in the passenger seat since then, so why was it laid back all the way again? Because they did know that Jessica had picked Keisha and Quentin up on the morning that she died, and that's not a normal way that people usually leave their seats positioned in. Police head to the Batesville dollar store where Quentin had told them that he had bought a Green Dot debit card because Quentin purchasing this prepaid Green Dot debit card was his alibi. And you can actually see him on CCTV cameras at 8:26 p.m. purchasing this prepaid debit card. 8:26 p.m. was only about 20 minutes after the 911 call was placed about the car being on fire. So now's probably a good time to mention that Batesville is only about a 10 or 15 minute drive from Courtland. So if it was Quentin that did this to Jessica, then he would have potentially had enough time to leave the scene of the fire and drive to the Batesville dollar store just to have an alibi. But you would think that he would smell like gas or have had to have changed his clothes. And that's something that they bring up a lot in the trial is that the M&M gas station footage from the day that Jessica was killed shows Quentin in 3 different changes of clothes, which, I mean, you do you, boo. I don't change that often, but maybe other people do. So we're back to the interview where they questioned Quentin about the forgotten Taco Bell date. And this was about 6 months after Jessica's death. And there's something that I purposely did not tell you in part 1. And that is when investigators went to find Quentin to do this interview in particular with him. He was actually incarcerated at a prison in Monroe, Louisiana. Now, Quentin was being held in this prison for a charge that was unrelated to Jessica's case. But during the interview, Quentin tells investigators that he wasn't actually with Jessica at Taco Bell that night. That he was actually with his buddy, Big Mike. Quentin says that Big Mike had driven him to meet Jessica at Taco Bell to buy $10 worth of weed from her. But why wouldn't he tell investigators this from the jump? In a murder case, they do not care if you're buying weed. And would Big Mike be able to corroborate Quentin's alibi? Let's find out. So, police tracked down Big Mike and asked him if he had driven Quentin to Taco Bell that night to buy weed from Jessica. And Big Mike tells him that he knows for a fact that he wasn't with Quentin that night because he was actually out of town in Tennessee at a Tennessee Titans game. And that he had driven his own truck from Mississippi to Tennessee, so there's no possible way that he could have driven Quentin in his truck to meet Jessica at Taco Bell that night. So now the police have to go back to Quentin at the Louisiana prison and ask him why would he lie. Yet again, it's like he just keeps catching himself in different lies. What is the purpose of him lying about his whereabouts on the night that Jessica was murdered unless he has something to hide? And when they finally confront Quentin about he and Jessica's phone being in the same place at the same time the entire way from Courtland to Batesville and then from Batesville back to Courtland, Quentin finally breaks down and tells them that he had in fact been with Jessica that night, that they left Taco Bell. From Taco Bell, they went back to Quentin's house where they smoked weed in Jessica's car. And that after their smoke session, Jessica left at about 7 p.m., but that Quentin went back inside and he has not seen her alive since then. But supposedly, he was for real this time, y'all. So now it's time for investigators to bring out the fact that they can actually place Quentin with Jessica on the night in question from around 5:20 p.m. until about 7:30 p.m., and they were able to do this via cell phone analysis and pings. Let's remember that the 911 call about the fire came in at 8:12 p.m., so whatever happened leading up to Jessica and her car being set on fire had to have happened somewhere between the time frame of approximately 7:30 to 7:45-ish. Quentin, why you always lying, my guy? Phone records and the M&M gas station footage both show Jessica leaving his house at around 7:30 on the night of her murder. Not 7 o'clock like he said. Although a 30-minute time discrepancy doesn't seem that important, until you're talking about a case where a matter of minutes matters, like in this case. It also doesn't help that her phone doesn't show any more communication with anybody aside from Quentin at the 7:30-ish time frame. And oddly enough, Quentin's phone doesn't have any more communications around that time either. Jessica was found just a little ways up the road from Quentin's house, less than a few miles away from his house, actually. Police even tried to bring Quentin's mom into the interrogation room to see if she could get her son to confess to murdering Jessica. And Quentin's mom isn't shy about the fact that she doesn't think her son is capable of murder. But it's like I always say, we're all capable of murder. The only difference between us and a murderer is one bad day and one even worse choice. That's just something I've always lived by. But from here, in order for us to finish Jessica's story, we kind of have to discuss the charges on Quentin from Louisiana, because it does become a pretty important factor in this case, in my opinion. So now, let's backtrack just a little bit to why Quentin had been arrested in Louisiana, shall we? Quentin had actually got arrested just a few months before the investigators were looking for him to come and speak to him when they found him in the Louisiana jail. He had been arrested for withdrawing $2,000 from a bank account that belonged to an exchange student that was attending the University of Louisiana. This student's name was Ming-Chi Shao, and she went by the name Mandy. But wait, there's more. Quentin was also charged with Mandy's murder. So if it wasn't bad enough that he went from stealing thousands of dollars from a student that's already in a foreign country just trying to get an education, allegedly he also murdered her. And this murder was also an extremely brutal murder. Mandy's body was found in her own apartment, and it was determined that she had been stabbed at least 34 times. She was found pretty far into the decomposition progress, and it seemed like she had also been tortured to death. Her body was found on the same day that Quentin Tellis married the same girlfriend that he had been buying the prepaid Green Dot card for at the dollar store that is seen on CCTV footage that is his supposed alibi for Jessica's murder. And the two married on August 8th. Police were able to track down 2 separate phone calls that were made on the day of Mandy's death, and the calls were to the Chase Bank, and the calls were to the number that's listed on the back of Mandy's debit card. Both calls were ended before the automated bot was able to answer. These calls were made almost back-to-back at 8:16 p.m. and again at 8:18 p.m. When police looked into Quentin's cell phone data, they were able to determine that Quentin had dialed those same 2 numbers that are listed on the back of Mandy's debit card 2 separate times on the same day, except this time her card number and PIN were both entered from his phone on the exact timestamps 8:16 and 8:18. And you would think that Jessica's case would have taught him a thing or two about cell phone data, but he must not have been paying attention. Quentin actually pled guilty to the fraudulent bank charges, but pled not guilty to the murder of Mandy. But what are the odds that one person is charged with 2 separate murders in 2 separate states, and he claims he's innocent in both trials? I think those odds are about slim to none. There were witnesses that saw Quentin coming and going from Mandy's apartment building in the days leading up to her murder. There's also CCTV footage of Quentin and Mandy together at the Walmart superstore. Police also found receipts inside of Quentin's apartment that matched some of the charges that had been made on Mandy's debit card after she was already presumed to be dead. As if this wasn't enough evidence, there's also a man by the name of Eric that came forward to tell investigators working on Mandy's murder that Quentin had told him that he stabbed and slashed Mandy until she finally gave him the PIN to her debit card. So basically he's walking around bragging about torturing this poor woman and then stealing her money. This is not a good look for Quentin. Actually, none of this is really a good look for him. And as far as the man named Eric goes that claimed that Quentin told him all of this information, well, since his name was Eric, the police did look into him in regards to Jessica's case, but that was also a dead end. If I'm being honest with y'all, part of me wonders about this marriage between Quentin and his longtime girlfriend, because they just so happened to get married on the same day that Mandy's body was found dead in her apartment. It makes me think that maybe this was some kind of thing where they both knew that spouses can't testify against one another in most states, but that's just me. I would really like to hear somebody else's thoughts on this. Like, DM me on Twitter or Instagram and let me know if you think that makes sense. So now we know why Quentin is sitting in prison when police went back to question him again in regards to Jessica Chambers. So from here, let's jump forward a little bit to February of 2016. Because on February 24th, 2016, police finally indicted Quentin Tellis for the murder of Jessica Chambers. Prosecutor John Champion made it very clear in his opening statement that he's aware that Jessica named either a Derek or Eric in her last few words on Earth, and he also makes it very clear that Quentin's name is not Derek or Eric. But he also tells the jury not to let that sway them in one way or another, to listen to the facts and the timeline, and to make their own decision on whether or not they think that Quentin is innocent or guilty. And the defense attorney used this same unknown piece of the puzzle, the Eric or Derek piece, when she made her opening statement to make sure the jury knows that whoever Eric or Derek is, that's who should be sitting on trial for Jessica's murder, not Quentin Tellis. And something I read in a few places that I don't want to say is fact is that apparently a few people have claimed that Jessica kind of called Quentin Eric as a pet name, like instead of honey or babe or sweetie. But that, like I said, that's not fact, and it doesn't even really make a lot of sense. It doesn't sound like his name, it's not a shorter version of his name, and it's not really a pet name. Just something strange that I thought I would mention. Something else that you may see if you go in to research this case on your own that I also could not prove as fact is that apparently Quentin used to go by the name Eric, but again, I could not find this anywhere as factual. Again, just something that you may see if you research this case on your own. The very first witness that was called to the stand in Quentin's trial was Jessica's mom, Lisa. And Lisa laid out the last few movements that Jessica made while she was still at home before she left that evening to grab something to eat. The second person to be called to the stand was Keisha Meyer, who is Jessica's best friend, and who is also one of the last people that was known to see Jessica and spend time with her on the day that she was killed. Keisha is the friend that Jessica picked up that morning with Quentin when the three hung out, rode around, smoked pot, and grabbed lunch. Keisha told defense attorneys during cross-examination that Jessica had a reputation for selling pot and that she was selling almost every day. This is something that Jessica's mom, Lisa, says that she doesn't believe, even though this isn't the first person to say this about Jessica. Cole Haley was a volunteer firefighter and one of the first people on the scene the night that Jessica was found walking down the road towards first responders covered in ash and char. And Cole actually knew Jessica, though they weren't friends, but they did know of each other. And Cole had lived in the town of Courtland his whole life, too. He says that when he first saw Jessica, that he did not recognize her at all. He didn't even know if this was a man or a woman, or possibly even a young teen, though he would later come to realize that it was Jessica. Cole explains that she was completely nude except for her underwear, but once Cole saw that Jessica was naked except for her underwear, he immediately grabbed a blanket to cover her body up with, so that even though this person probably wasn't going to make it, they would still have some dignity about them. When Cole was asked to describe to the jury what Jessica looked like when she arrived on scene, you can see the emotion just jolt through his entire body as he tries to explain through tears what he walked up on the evening of December 2014. This is Cole trying to describe to the jury what Jessica looked like when he walked up on the scene.
Saying, "Help me, help me, help me."
Now, Cole, I want you to describe for this jury, what did she look like? What was the condition of Jessica Chambers?
Her hair was fried out like she'd stuck it in a light socket, and she had black all over her face. Her body was severely burned, and I wrapped a blanket around her to conceal her. She reached out for my hand. I held on to her hand, and her mouth, inside her mouth was just char black. And when I asked her name, she said Jessica Chambers, and she was not recognizable to me. I know what Jessica Chambers looked like. Knowing this is Courtland, I said, "This is Jessica Chambers, not Chambers."
In all your years of being a firefighter, have you ever seen anything like this?
No, sir. I hope I never see anything like it again.
And I know that was hard to listen to. I've listened to it a few times, and it does not get easier. But the audio is a little wonky sometimes, so I'm going to read you what he said. Cole says, quote, "Her hair was fried out like she had stuck it in a light socket. And, she had black all over her face. Her body was severely burned, and I wrapped a blanket around her to conceal her. She reached out for my hand, and I held onto her hand, and her mouth, inside her mouth, was just char black. And when I asked her name, she said Jessica Chambers. And she was not recognizable to me, and I know what Jessica Chambers looked like. Knowing this is Courtland, I said this is Jessica Chambers, not Chambers." The last question that Cole was asked was if he was still on the Courtland Volunteer Fire Department, and he simply answers, "No, sir, I'm not." This really messed Cole up, and there's other people that will say the same thing. And this is a short audio clip of Ben Chambers, Jessica's dad, saying the exact same thing.
Cole, I mean, it messed that boy up. You know, he needs professional help. And he said, "I'm so sorry, I couldn't do more." I mean, it just tore me apart, you know, how it done destroyed his life.
And this is volunteer firefighter Eddie Eidson, also talking about Cole Haley.
Cole, I'd trade spots for that kid any day. He's a good kid. And all he ever wanted to do was just be a firefighter and help somebody. It wasn't fair with what happened to Jessica, but then, you know, it all trickles downhill. Everybody affected by it. Yeah.
Just from those two short clips, I feel like you can see what an impact this case had on Courtland. A lot of the volunteer firefighters and even trained firefighters never returned to work after they went to this crime scene. One of the two defense attorneys that Quentin and his family hired for this trial, Alton Peterson, made a pretty valid point during cross-examination of the lead investigator, Barry Thompson, who had first questioned Quentin on December 10th, 2014, just 4 days after Jessica's death. Alton Peterson asked lead investigator Barry Thompson how Quentin was supposed to be able to give him his exact whereabouts since they hadn't been able to give an exact time of when the crime took place. And Barry Thompson responded with the fact that there was an estimated time frame in which the crime had occurred. But still, not being able to pinpoint an exact time, it does seem like a good defense tactic. Even though I'm really not sure how most of these defense attorneys sleep at night with a clear conscience, that's besides the point. Another valid point that the defense made in this trial was the fact that lead investigator Barry Thompson was working on this case remotely via phone calls for the first few days of its initial investigation. And as far as when he was on the stand, he didn't seem to be sure of anything. He wasn't sure as to when the car was moved from the scene to be processed, or how long after the murder it was before a team was sent out to look for evidence on the ground outside, around where the car had been found burning. Jessica's dad, Ben Chambers, was pretty upset about the way that this questioning went between the defense and Barry Thompson. He's quoted saying, quote, "Barry, hell, he didn't know nothing, and he's supposed to be over all of it. He couldn't tell you anything. I could tell you more of what went on than he did. Why didn't you go over all that before you come to damn trial?" And that's a pretty good point. Why wouldn't you go over the facts and details before trial so that you don't get up there and look like a jackass? Some of Jessica's family was also pretty upset about the way lead investigator Barry Thompson was running the investigation in the first few days, because he wasn't in town, so he was basically just calling and giving orders over the phone without actually being there and seeing any of it. Some of the evidence that was collected after first responders were able to get to the car and put the fire out were a small piece of what was left of Jessica's bra, and they found her phone laying kind of under the car, almost like the phone had fallen out of the car when the door was open. And this bra thing always makes me wonder if someone sexually assaulted or raped Jessica before she was set on fire, or if she was with someone who she willingly had sex with and things took a wrong turn. I guess we'll never know because her body was burned too badly for any kind of rape kit or sexual assault kit to be done. But that does beg the question of if she took her own clothes off or if someone took them off of her or if they were burned off of her. Because it's believed that Jessica's body had been burning anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes before first responders got there. And if I were to just let the background noise of this podcast run for a solid 3 to 5 minutes, everybody would be uncomfortable and skip until they hear me talk again. I honestly don't think any one person would be able to sit and listen to 3 to 5 minutes of silence and equate that with how long Jessica had actually been on fire. There were also 2 separate lighters around Jessica's car, and her car was moved from the scene of the crime to an impound lot for processing shortly after the fire was put out, and it was either on the same day of the fire or the following day. But a lot of people wonder if that was even enough time to look around the area and collect evidence that may not have been found in the darkness of the nighttime. Like, if they moved that car the same night, what's to say that they didn't destroy evidence in the process? And remember the gas jug that Quentin willingly told police that he had and even showed them where he kept it? It was never taken as evidence. It was never brought into the trial as an actual piece of evidence. So if Quentin is the one that doused Jessica in gas and set her and her car on fire, wouldn't the gas jug seem like a pretty important piece of evidence? And the way that the prosecution tried to lay it out to the jury, like the way that this crime went down, is supposedly that Quentin and Jessica were smoking in her car in Quentin's mom's yard, and that Quentin propositioned Jessica for sex, and when she denied him, he got enraged and choked or suffocated her until he thought that she was dead. Then he drove her in her car to what would end up being the crime scene and set her and her car on fire, not realizing that she was actually still alive. So, if that is the theory that the prosecution is going with in order to charge Quentin, the gas jug seems like it would be the key factor as far as evidence goes. Another thing was that the first responders that swear they kept hearing Jessica say Eric or Derek, you also have to take into account that the fact that there are multiple fire trucks, ambulances, other first responders, and their vehicles roaring in the background, along with the chaos and the adrenaline, the car is still engulfed in flames in the background. So how good would their hearing have actually been? And how much of what Jessica was saying was actually able to be made out into clear speech? Like I mentioned before, her vocal cords were actually burned. Her tongue was completely singed from the flames. Even if she was trying to say one thing, there's a very real possibility that it came out sounding like something completely different. Online web sleuths have thrown around so many different theories in this case, and one of them that kind of stuck with me that I read is that Jessica told first responders that either Eric or Derek did this to her, and people have speculated that instead she was actually saying Tellis, which happens to be Quentin's last name, and one of the last people that saw her alive on the day that she was murdered. So I almost wonder if Eric or Derek could be translated to Tellis with the smoke and soot inhalation and the fact that her vocal cords and tongue are both burned. I just wonder if that would even be possible. And like I mentioned in part 1, there were multiple medical experts that testified that Jessica's speech would not have been comprehensible and that there's a likely chance that she wasn't able to speak at all. And even though all of this evidence against Quentin Tellis is circumstantial, the police don't usually indict someone for murder unless they think they have enough evidence to win the case. But regardless, there would be a jury trial for Quentin Tellis for the murder of Jessica Chambers. One of the first persons of interest in Jessica's case that I mentioned in part 1 was George Boone. And Boone actually showed up at the courthouse to watch the trial. And right before he walked in, he was speaking to a reporter. And he actually told this reporter on camera that when he walked through the doors of the courthouse, that they would probably throw cuffs on him, slam him to the ground, and do some other things. Which is exactly what happened. They did arrest him as soon as he stepped foot into the courthouse for a supposed warrant that he had. The trial lasted from October 10th to October 16th, and during the trial, the prosecution tried to kind of get ahead of the Eric or Derek thing and they laid it out to the jury almost immediately in their opening statements, which was probably the smart thing for them to do. That way the defense wouldn't have a chance to spring it on the jury and give them reasonable doubt. But when the jury came back, it was clear that the jurors didn't exactly understand their jobs. When the judge asked if they had reached a conclusion, one of the jury members stood up and said that they found Quentin Tellis not guilty, which seems easy enough, right? Except, right after this, another juror stood up to tell the judge, "That's not my verdict." So this left the judge and the rest of the courtroom in a kind of a state of shock. The judge had to explain that the verdict had to be unanimous, meaning that everyone has to agree on the verdict. The jury was sent back to deliberate and told to come back out when they had a unanimous verdict. And when the jury came back out for the second time, they told the judge that they couldn't come to a verdict that everyone could agree to. And that, my friends, is what we call a hung jury. Trial over, case closed, that's it. Except not really, because it didn't even take a year for the prosecution to indict Quentin Tellis again for the murder of Jessica. But literally against all odds, the second jury to sit on the trial of Quentin Tellis also came back with a hung jury. These trials were so publicized that they were streaming live on a lot of different news stations and online streaming services. People in Courtland and across the board were glued to their TV screens, phone screens, computer screens, just to watch these trials. And even though the case of Jessica Chambers is still considered an unsolved case, the police and the DA both agree that they will likely try Quentin Tellis again for Jessica's murder. And even though Quentin did have 2 separate jury trials in the case of Jessica, it has not been proven that Quentin Tellis is innocent. So even though the DA and Sheriff Darby both think that Jessica's murderer is Quentin, the DNA evidence is underwhelming at best. And he may have killed Mandy, but did he actually kill Jessica? I can't decide if I think he did it or not, because honestly, there just isn't a lot of DNA or hard evidence that says yes or no. Except for the fact that he was also on trial for another murder of a woman in Louisiana who we mentioned earlier. But something that's always made me wonder, if he wasn't innocent, why would he talk to the police over and over again without a lawyer present? He always cooperated with the police and investigators all the way up until they finally indicted him for the murder charge. He's not a stupid man, and I don't care what the police are questioning you about. Never, ever, 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 ever go into an interview room without a lawyer. Even if you know for a fact that you're innocent or whatever that they claim the allegations are, everyone knows to lawyer up, even if you don't think you need one. It's always better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. And that is all the life advice I have, because I have been winging my life since I was 14. I do know that there are multiple people that have been interviewed that live in or around Courtland that don't know Quentin and didn't know Jessica, and they say that they believe that Quentin was kind of just picked for this murder, and that the state has taken it too far now to be able to say that somebody else is responsible. There's people that even say that they don't trust the investigation tactics of the officers working in Panola County. Something else that doesn't tie directly into this case, but something that's kind of linked to this case, is that Travis Sanford, who was 33 in 2019 and who was Jessica's boyfriend at the time she was murdered, the same boyfriend that was in prison when her murder occurred, he was actually shot and killed by a buckshot from a shotgun in 2019 over a dice game where he was assumed to have owed another player upwards of about $700. The story behind Travis goes that he and a few friends had been playing dice all night, probably drinking, probably smoking, and that things got heated and out of hand. Travis's girlfriend and 2 small children were also inside the house at the time that Travis was shot. Quentin was indicted by a grand jury on charges related to the murder of Mandy and the unlawful use of her stolen debit card in Louisiana in May of 2019, and was sentenced to 10 years for being a habitual offender as far as the unlawful debit card charges go. Oddly enough, though, the lead DA that will be prosecuting that murder trial for Mandy against Quentin is named Holly Chambers Jones. It's like he really can't stay away from women with the last name Chambers. Quentin waived his right to a jury trial in Mandy's case and wished to be tried in front of a judge alone instead. His court date has been rescheduled several times since 2019 because COVID. And sadly, Jessica's mom, Lisa, passed away on Friday, October 29th, 2021, at a pretty early age of just 52. So her quote about not being happy until she's with Jessica again hopefully came true, and the two have been reunited in whatever afterlife they believed in. And that is all I have for the case of Jessica Chambers. I will keep you updated and posted as things progress with Quentin Tellis. And I have some exciting news. There is a coffee company called Triangle Coffee Company that likes the show, and listeners of Mama Murdered a Podcast get a 10% off code when you use code MAMA10. That's MOMMA10. Go to trianglecoffeecompany.com to get your order in now. And on that note, I will see you again, same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.